and welcome to The Current. This is the North Central Region Water Network's Speed Networking webinar series. I'm Rebecca Power, joining you from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I will be your moderator. A lot of you are familiar with the North Central Region Water Network, but for those of you that are not, we are an extension-led collaboration among 12 land-grant universities and our partners in 12 upper Midwestern states. And as we have been saying for all of what feels like March-tober, for any of you that term, we want to thank you. Thanks to all of you for all you're doing out there, taking care of our land and water, keeping a steady hand on the rudder and an eye on our collective vision for clean water and healthy, resilient communities, however you do that in your work. Today, we are focused on some specific mandatory state nutrient management programs in the North Central region. One that is Ohio's Agricultural Fertilization Application Certification and Training, and a new program from Minnesota, their Groundwater Protection Rule. Before we introduce our speakers, just a few notes here for how these sessions work. Please submit your questions for the presenters in the chat box. That chat box is accessible in the lower right-hand corner of your screen with that little purple tab, and you should get the little bubble that comes up, the thought bubble for chat. We will keep those questions for a dedicated Q&A session after all three of our speakers are done, and we try to allow enough time to get all of our questions in, and usually are able to get that done. A phone-in option available and can be accessed by opening up what we call the session menu. It's that little hamburger menu in the upper left of your screen, and selecting use your phone for audio. We do record these sessions. They are available shortly after the live version at northcentralwater.org and learn.extension.org. We're also live tweeting this event, so you can follow us on Twitter. And please feel free to share this information broadly after it's done, those that you think might be interested. All right, so on to today's presenters. Give you a quick look here. Chrissy Kaminski, Program Manager for the Pesticide Safety Education Program with Ohio State University Extension. Luke Stewie, Pesticide and Fertilizer Management Division, Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and Greg Klinger, Extension Educator of Agriculture Water Quality Protection at the Minnesota Water Resource Center. So with that, let's get started. So part of the purpose of these webinars is to introduce you to the great people that are doing this work across the North Central region, in addition to the work that they are actually doing, giving you a little taste of that. So that's the speed networking part. So here's a little bit about Chrissy and the background that she comes to this work with. I'm not going to read it. I'll just let you read it and give Chrissy the time to tell us a little bit more about what she's doing. So with that, I will turn it over to Chrissy.
Great, thank you. Can you guys hear me out there?
Loud and clear.
So. Perfect. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. My name is Chrissy Kaminski. I'm the Program Manager of Commercial Pesticide Applicators with the Pesticide Safety Program at Ohio State University Extension. And with the Pesticide Safety Education Program, we work closely with our regulatory agency in Ohio, the Ohio Department of Agriculture. And the ODA works mostly with licensing, fees, inspection, and enforcement. And what we do over at Pesticide Safety is we provide and facilitate educational opportunities to pesticide and fertilizer applicators in Ohio. And today I've been asked to just give an overview of our nutrient management laws. Let's see, next, okay. So, well, sorry, getting used to this. We're going to start with a snapshot of Ohio. I'm coming to you from right here in Columbus. Ohio is part of two large watersheds. Our northern part is draining into Lake Erie, which isn't labeled here, but it's right here. And then this is Michigan right here. And then our southern part drains into the Ohio River down here, which goes into the Mississippi and then the Gulf. And in Ohio, we have a decent amount of crop and agriculture, especially in this northwestern corner and in the western part of Lake Erie as well, or Ohio. So to dive into the topic of this presentation, Ohio has been in the news the past few years for a harmful algal bloom issue, especially up in Lake Erie. We have another big lake in that western portion of Ohio, Grand Lake St. Mary's, and they are also plagued with algal blooms. Most notably, in 2014, the city of Toledo, which is in the northwestern part of Ohio, right on the lake, had its drinking water shut down for 500,000 residents because of a microcystin problem in the lake because of the harmful algal blooms. So that is not the way you really want your state to make the New York Times. In response to our harmful algal bloom issues, Ohio passed an agricultural nutrient law. Land use and runoff studies found that most of the excess nutrient runoff into the lake is a result of agriculture. So this law requires farmers applying fertilizer to get certified through the state. And the certification process aims to teach farmers best management practices of applying fertilizer and helping them to voluntarily reduce nutrient loads and runoff from their farms. This certification was implemented in mid-2014, and then it gave farmers a little over 3 years to get the certification. So it wasn't in full swing until 2017. The Ohio Department of Agriculture is the regulatory agency managing the certifications. For those first 3 years, well, 3.5 from 2014 to 2017, Ohio State University Extension exclusively handled all of the education and certification opportunities. So there was just a real push to help farmers become a little more educated and be more effective at managing the nutrients on their farm. For the nuts and bolts of the law, this nutrient law applies to farmers applying fertilizer to 50 acres or more of agricultural production. So smaller farms are not included in this. This law includes fertilizer products with a guaranteed analysis, predominantly nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In general, manure application is excluded unless there's that guaranteed analysis. And again, this law is only for those producing an agricultural commodity. So lawn and landscape folks are not included in this. Now, if you have like a 50+ acre sod farm that you're fertilizing and you're selling the sod, that would be included. But in Ohio, we don't really have a glut of sod farms. So in general, our lawn and landscape folks are excluded from this. Farmers fertilizing forage for their own landscape or their own livestock are also exempt. This only includes crops for sale. Applicators who are certified livestock managers or continuing crop advisors are considered to have enough training by the ODA. That's a professional organization that provides a lot of education. So if they just prove that they're in good standing with these organizations, then that's enough to get this certification. They don't have to do the additional trainings. In Ohio, pesticide applicators are legally required to keep application records. And for fertilizer applicators, it's the same. So the ODA does conduct random audits of these records on a yearly basis. It's not a ton, but they are going out there and making sure that fertilizer applicators are keeping up with their records. Also, if an applicator is accused of misapplication, these records serve as evidence in the investigation, and they help to recreate and understand the conditions that were present during the application. Although I spoke to the ODA before this, and there have only been 3 complaints since 2014, so it's not really that big of an issue. In Ohio, our pesticide and fertilizer license and certifications are on a 3-year cycle. So just as a rule of thumb, most things happen in 3s with us. So the records have to be kept for 3 years. How do applicators become certified here? Most opt to complete a 3-hour training. In that 2014 to 2017 introductory period, the 3-hour trainings were the only way to get certified, and they were taught exclusively by Ohio State University Extension. But now applicators can study this manual and take an exam, but most opt to complete that training. To remain certified, applicators must complete 1 hour of continuing education every 3 years. And this is just so we can continue to see them and provide them with the most up-to-date recommendations. They also have the option to take the test every 3 years, but we find that a lot of our applicators in Ohio are test adverse, so they really would rather take those trainings. Ohio State Extension, well, we have a lot of folks, but we have 3 agronomists who helped develop the manual and the outline for the training and recertification. They hold an annual in-service so that our educators can teach this information to their clientele. In Ohio, our extension program has educators in almost every county, so they're out there teaching this to their applicators in their counties. Excuse me. So what do these trainings cover? The goal of the trainings is to help farmers know what, when, and where to apply nutrients to their crops. Some of the topics covered are the 4 R's, the right rate, source, time, and place of applying nutrients. They also how to create a voluntary nutrient management plan. A lot of time is spent on how to properly sample the soil of the farmer's field and then how to interpret those results. So that way they're not really relying just on what their vendors are telling them. They know what it means and what it means for their field. And then the tri-state recommendations cover topics such as how often to sample soil, pH and lime recommendations, and specific nutrient recommendations for different crops. And when these recommendations are updated, they're also covered in research. And if you're wondering, our tri-state is Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. So just a little history. During that initial period to get people certified, extension educators and specialists held 368 meetings. And in 2017, we had 17,255 folks with the certificate. And right now, as of yesterday, we had 15,397. And we think that this 2,000 person drop there was a very big push to get people certified, and people who didn't actually need it did get certified, and they just let it drop off their license. I had to talk a lot of landscape folks out of getting the certification because everybody just wanted to cover their bases. So that 2,000 drop is just, we are fairly certain it's the people who didn't actually need it. So that was a rapid fire explanation of our nutrient law in Ohio. And that certification covers fertilizer applicators in the entire state from north to south, west, east. But I want to mention an additional set of requirements for the Lake Erie Western Basin watershed. And this map is showing you the northwest portion of Ohio. So Indiana's right here, Michigan's here, Toledo's up here, and then this watershed in this blue line has an additional set of recommendations. This area has a high agricultural land cover, and it's particularly vulnerable to algal blooms. This is the area that had that water shut down in 2014. So in 2015, an additional set of regulations was implemented in this area. For lack of time, it regulates manure as well and prohibits when fertilizer can be applied. So it doesn't allow fertilizer to be applied to frozen and saturated soils in order to prevent excess runoff to here. The law covering all of Ohio really wants voluntary compliance. So we want to just get people out there, teach them how to keep the nutrients in their field, how to save money and sample soils. But this extra law is managing when they can apply. So here is our fertilizer website. It's nutrieneducation.osu.edu, and then our main website is pested.osu.edu. And you can always feel free to email me if you have any questions about pesticides or fertilizer in Ohio, and then I'll also be sticking around until the end. So thank you, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chrissy. And we've got some questions building up here for you in the chat box. We'll get to those in a few minutes. But next, we'll go on to the Minnesota's new Groundwater Protection Rule. And our first presenter will be Luke Stewie in the Pesticide and Fertilizer Management Division in the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And again, you can just read a little bit about Luke there in the screen, and we will get on to his presentation. So thank you so much for joining us, Luke.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'll jump right in the interest of time, and open with just an explanation. Throughout the sequence of slides, I'm going to cover a couple just kind of foundational pieces to both our plan and rule. Spend a couple of slides on the plan, but the majority will be about our groundwater protection rule. And just to note, on the whole, this is really our state's plan or approach to mitigate the risk of nitrogen loss, nitrogen fertilizer lost into groundwater. So some foundational statements to make as I get into describing our plan and our approach. One is to just acknowledge nitrate leaching from fertilizer is an exceptionally challenging problem. There isn't a simple solution. We really need to recognize that in a row crop system, absolutely no loss of nitrogen below that root system is exceptionally challenging, if not impossible. So there are very, very real challenges involved in this process, and this is something that we acknowledged at the outset of this effort. In our state, there was a Groundwater Protection Act passed in 1989 that provided the authority for us to create this plan and subsequent rule. And one piece to this particular statement is the second item, and it says that it's recognized that for some human activities, this degradation prevention goal cannot be practically achieved. So in following what I've stated previously, we're dealing with a very challenging problem. We have actually language in the Act recognizing in some cases it may not be practically achieved. So we're recognizing that, and then in our response, encouraging movement toward methods and technology that could go above and beyond basic response. So I think that will become more clear as I step further. Hold on. There. So the plan. This is a much more comprehensive and larger document to fully describe our state's approach, the review of information that we considered in devising a response to the elevated nitrate levels in groundwater due to fertilizer use. So it really is our blueprint as a state to guide our response. It was developed initially in 1989, and now more recently for about a 5-year process incorporating input from several organizations, academic, our agricultural partners, environmental folks. We put together this plan. And the key pieces to our plan are really 3 things. It's about the science, it's taking a targeted approach, and engaging with our local stakeholders to come up with some solutions that can work. So those 3 pieces are tenets to our approach and plan. And wherever possible, we would like to utilize this approach to prevent nitrogen from, nitrogen levels from becoming elevated in our groundwater resource. Okay, now I'm going to segue a little and jump into the rule, and let me kind of help ease this transition some. So I touched on just some foundational tenets of this, both the plan and rule. Briefly describe the plan, and that it's a much more in-depth review of the information used to come to this rule. And then here's our rule. So the plan describes everything, and the rule is really the regulatory piece associated with that plan. Soon after the plan was developed in 2015, we moved right into this rule development process. And really it took the better part of 3.5, 4 years to finalize that rule and become law, involved in getting a lot of public input. In fact, in our state, there are some requirements, and we've done additional listening sessions and posting periods to ensure we got a lot of input, and we made substantial changes, very substantial changes based on some of that input. And I think that puts together our rule, and a bit stronger rule than it could have been without that. Oh, I keep pushing the wrong button. The rule applies to nitrogen fertilizer. As I was listening, Chrissy, I noted some similarities. It does not regulate manure. In Minnesota, our rule doesn't regulate manure, and it focuses on areas where we have vulnerable groundwater. Talking about that targeting approach that we recognized in our plan, that comes through in our rule. And there's 2 distinctive parts. We call them Part 1 and we call them Part 2. Part 1 is about fall nitrogen use restriction in targeted areas. And Part 2 is responding in drinking water supply management areas, or areas where that land surface impacts a public well, and where an area has been defined through modeling to illustrate where their groundwater comes from, that public well's groundwater comes from. So Part 1, a few slides to touch on Part 1. As I stated earlier, this is a restriction of fall nitrogen fertilizer. A couple of slides ago, I indicated that in June of 2019, this rule went in, became law. In fact, it wasn't until this September 1st of 2020, that Part 1 of our rule took effect. So we are really just beginning in Minnesota, the first fall application season where this rule takes effect. And the rule comes with some targeting aspects to it. On this image, you see areas that are darker in purple, and then some smaller areas, I apologize for the scale, that are drinking water supply management areas, community water supplies where the restriction takes place. There's consideration for some exceptions and exclusions to this Part 1 of the rule, and I would like to spend a few moments to talk about those. So Part 1, the vulnerable groundwater areas. Oh, excuse me. I'm going to describe a little more clearly about where the rule takes effect before some exceptions. Part 1 affects areas where we have one of really 3 geologic features. We have coarse textured soils, shallow bedrock, or karst geology. That these features on the landscape create conditions where groundwater is especially sensitive to impacts from the land surface. From a boundary perspective, Part 1 of the rule is enforced on a quarter section basis. So if 50% or more of that quarter section is considered vulnerable, a GIS mapping exercise to show us where these conditions exist, then that entirety of the quarter section is subject to the restriction. And we have an exceptional map a GIS interactive map, and here's just a real quick glance at it and a website connection to it. But here a producer or landowner can zoom right into their farm and field and find out if they have this restriction applying to those acres. Now to the exclusions. In the state of Minnesota, we have 2 exclusions. One is a climatic exclusion, a statewide exclusion that actually really applies to our far northwestern corner. So here we have a lower precipitation on average, as well as conditions for evapotranspiration in a short planting season that really reduce the potential for leaching. So for that reason, the far northwestern part is excluded from the fall nitrogen use restriction. On the far northeastern part of Minnesota, it's very much a forested landscape, and we have less than 3% agriculture in that region, as well as Ramsey County in our most urban part of the state in the Twin Cities area. Those 2 are also excluded from the rule. Some exceptions. So separately from exclusions due to the climate or percentage of agriculture, exceptions for cases where we need to use nitrogen fertilizer in the fall include establishment of winter grains, pastures, perennial crops, grass seed, wild rice, and cover used for the reduction of soil fumigants and potato production. So these are a few of the instances where fall-in is really needed, and we've accepted that as an exception, and provided though that we definitely follow our land-grant university's rate guidelines in any case of these exceptions. In addition, exceptions for phosphorus needs on acres. We recognize that a component to our MAP, our DAP, our ammoniated phosphate products, is nitrogen. And so to address phosphorus needs in Minnesota, we'll allow about up to 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre as a part of our MAP or DAP application. Additionally, if we have soil test levels that suggest phosphorus needs will not be met, you can exceed that amount. Also, occasions of contamination or academic research, as so long as MDA has approval for those. So additional exceptions. Another part to this is recognition of a critically important program to our state, and it's called the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program. So this is a program unique right now in Minnesota that gives the producers the opportunity to go through a whole farm assessment to look at their conservation practices, risks for loss, and through this review process, sometimes bring in a little bit more conservation practices to become certified, or if already at operating at an exceptionally high level, they can become certified. So for those landowners and producers who enter this program and can become certified, we also consider those acres on that farm to be in compliance with our rule. So these producers really are top-notch in following, the best practices. And so we want to acknowledge that through our rule, and that is why we have the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification as a part of those exceptions. Now, enforcement. This is a question that often comes up, and I want to kind of address it. For our state, we are defining the responsible party for the fertilizer application that may be done, out of compliance as the owner, operator, or agent in charge of land. That means it's the person or the organization whom was responsible to make that fertilizer use decision. And it would be through an investigation that we would drive through to find that answer, because it could oftentimes be complicated. Our enforcement will be complaint-driven. For folks that have occasion to see fall-in use and concern about it, they will be able to submit a complaint, and we have a part of our division that is dedicated really to responding to egg chemical product use and storage complaints, both regarding pesticides as well as fertilizer now in relation to this rule. Now, part 2, a few slides on this one, and I'll be kind of segueing and providing the opening for Greg to bring in his part to this. But part 2 is really about a more targeting approach. The fall line restriction has implications statewide, but just in areas where we have vulnerable groundwater. Part 2 is just within these drinking water supply management areas, city water supplies, where nitrate levels are high. I use this drinking water supply management area statement. I want to just moment to explain what it is. And DWISMA is oftentimes the way we will refer to this acronym, but our state's Department of Health puts together this modeling. In this image, you can see that there's this blue ellipse, and herein lies a capture zone, so that groundwater below throughout a period of 10 years would make it to this water supply. And there's 2 wells in this illustration. The green line is a straight line on the land surface that you can see visually with the eye. This follows property boundaries, roadways, and in this, this is what we call a DWISMA, and drinking water supply management area. That's the area on the land surface we want to protect to mitigate that risk of contamination for a city's water supply. Key parts of Part 2 is to do what we can to prevent exceeding the standard. The standard being 10 parts per million, 10 milligrams per liter for nitrate in drinking water. Additionally, it is to engage with our ag stakeholders. It's really to bring together our ag stakeholders to find local solutions to a local problem. We have a challenge in sometimes a quite small area, these drinking water supply management areas, and bringing together ag stakeholders to find out what can work and put those practices in place along with them. We've coined the term alternative management, and that's, for us, it means things that go beyond the bare basic best management practices, things like the 4 R's, the right rate, timing, placement, products. AMTs are above that, could be cover, more precision application, and so forth. So I'm going to point to that later, but these are really the key pieces to it. Additionally, providing some priority for funding in these areas, and that's critical to help support the establishment of conservation or better practices where it's needed. Part 2, as a rule, will only begin on a voluntary basis. We have 4 levels, and initially it will begin at a voluntary basis, providing at a minimum 3 years for producers to establish practices to protect groundwater. And we won't go regulatory unless one of 2 things occur. One is that we are able to document BMPs are not adopted voluntarily, or 2, groundwater nitrogen levels increase. And so it's critically important to get engaged stakeholders and bring together some change where it's needed to better protect the groundwater here and avoid potential for regulation. But it always begins on a voluntary basis. Quick snapshot of the state. Here are DWISMAs across the state, indicated in yellow, red, or green dots. Levels 1 and 2 are those voluntary starts. And right now, we've made these mitigation levels for the first time in January of this year. So we do not have anyone in a regulatory role. It's still at a voluntary basis. And are right now working through trying to engage with these ag stakeholders and bring together the key players in these areas to discuss what's going on and what improvements could be made. To do that, we kind of have a term of local advisory teams for these ag stakeholders. And obviously right now in the pandemic we're in and challenges related to COVID, bringing together little groups like this and sometimes larger groups has been challenging. So we're really navigating how to do this virtually and with phone and doing really the best we can. A lot of planning, energy, and effort going into that right now. But this is, again, what I spoke to earlier. It's bringing together the local producers to discuss the local challenge that exists and engage them in the process. What can work here? And whenever possible, look at opportunities to bring some science there to this group to help them understand, whether it be some modeling or additional research available on this landscape or practices that could apply, and help them find the solutions that can help protect the groundwater. And here we as an agency have spent some time bringing together our own. We have research scientists, soil scientists, coordinators, and in fact have supported positions at our land-grant university extension office. And our following speakers, one of those And they have a really important role in these conversations to do just that, bring the recommendations from our university and the most current research and science to help producers see the value of these practices. The last slide, I think, before I leave, and this is something that all throughout we really want to promote to the extent we can. Best management practices have the potential to become required under our rule. And in the far future, alternative management tools could as well. However, that will be with some limitations. We believe in some of these landscapes, AMTs are an important part to this. Steps beyond the 4 Rs, potentially looking at changes in rotation or some targeted land use changes, exceptionally, use of the technology and precision application approaches. These are the practices we think that hold really high potential to create change in the groundwater. And so AMTs are a really important part of this, and we try to bring that into the conversation early with local teams and often. So with that, thank you. Contact information on there. And I know that the large group will get a PDF of this, and you'll be able to grab that and some of the other links. And so by all means, reach out if you have any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Luke. And normally we don't do this, but because we have a lot of questions and because I'm looking at some of them and they seem like they could be fairly easily answered in the chat box, I am going to just invite any of our speakers, if you feel like there's a question in the chat box that you could answer fairly quickly in the chat box, to go ahead and start doing that. And I'm just going to, but we'll get to as many of them as we can verbally after our next presenter, Greg Klinger, is done. So Greg, thank you so much for joining us. Greg is an extension educator of agricultural water quality protection with the Minnesota Water Resource Center at the University of Minnesota. So thank you, Greg, and take it away.
Thanks, Rebecca. First off, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me just fine.
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks everyone for being here. As Rebecca mentioned, my name is Greg Klinger, and I work for the University of Minnesota, working in the world of agricultural water quality protection. One thing I do as part of my job relates directly to the Groundwater Protection Rule Luke mentioned, which is that I provide technical guidance to local groups of farmers and agricultural professionals that are convened by the MDA in these local advisory teams. As Luke alluded to, one of the ways in which farmers are essentially judged or as to be in compliance with this rule is whether they're following nitrogen best management practices, or BMPs, under cropland. BMPs being essentially research-based practices on what sort of nitrogen fertilizer rates, timing, form, and placement are appropriate for different cropping systems and under different soil types and climate conditions. So I thought I'd just share a few quick thoughts about the importance of BMPs for limiting nitrates getting into groundwater. Oops. I guess I could have skipped that first slide. In any case, so what does research tell us can have significant impacts on the amount of nitrates leaving agricultural land and getting into groundwater? Probably the biggest thing is what you're growing on the landscape. Row crops just naturally are more prone to nitrate loss than your broadcast, or just what I'd consider densely drilled crops. And definitely they're more prone to loss than perennial crops, for reasons that mostly have to do with the amount of root growth they have and root activity, as well as when during the year they're taking up nitrogen from the ground. For example, research in Minnesota would show that a perennial like alfalfa is typically going to have no more nitrate loss to groundwater than, say, CRP land or other, quote unquote, natural landscapes. Another thing that's really critical to nitrate losses is weather, primarily rainfall patterns, as well as the interaction between temperature and rainfall. Just as an example, I've seen research results in our state where even corn fertilized with really high rates of nitrogen, and we'd say something like 270 or so pounds per acre of nitrogen for corn and soybeans, which is really high. in a really dry year might lose only about 5 pounds or so of nitrate. In a really wet year, even completely unfertilized corn, it's possible it could lose 15 or 20 pounds per acre of nitrate. So really wet and warm at the wrong time can have a huge impact on nitrate losses. So those are the two largest impacts on nitrate losses. The other two categories I'd point out would be edge of field practices. These are things like bioreactors, constructed wetlands, controlled drainage structures, and then nitrogen fertilizer management practices, or the use of these best management practices. And these two things have a little less of an overall impact on nitrate losses than cropping system and weather, but can still have some very large impacts. And one of the things I'd point out is that, while cropping system and weather might have more impact on nitrates overall, there's something that farmers either can't control in the case of the weather or have somewhat limited control over in the case of cropping system. And what I really mean by that is that, for instance, converting land to alfalfa, especially on a large scale, well, I mean, if a farmer doesn't have livestock to feed that to, or can't find buyers for it, or frankly just can't find buyers that he can sell it to for a profit, it just is not necessarily going to be a sustainable thing for the long term. And one other thing I'd mention is that for the edge of field or in-stream practices, a lot of those are not capable of being installed in certain types of landscapes, or they might be a situation where they protect surface water from nitrates, but not groundwater. And I live in southeast Minnesota, and it's typically what we see in this area where water infiltration to groundwater from fields, it's really rapid and it's direct, and usually it completely bypasses our stream systems altogether. So those edge of field things aren't necessarily going to be effective at protecting groundwater. In contrast to those, nitrogen management and nitrogen BMPs are things that farmers do have a great deal of control over. And we also find, they have a pretty high return on investment. In other words, if you're following BMPs, you're more often than not going to save money over the long run and also reduce nitrate losses. So what does the research tell us about BMPs? Keep in mind, these are similar to the 4 R's of fertilizer management. The right rate, the right time, the right form, the right placement of fertilizer. And that they do change for different crops and for different soil or climate types. In most situations, I'd say the research is very clear that overall nitrogen rate, what that rate is that's being applied, has by far the biggest impact on nitrate losses to groundwater of any of these BMPs. I will add the caveat that how much that impact really depends on what your starting point is with rate. So, for example, if someone who's growing continuous corn, we're applying at a pretty high rate, let's say 240, 250 pounds an acre of nitrogen, and decided to reduce the nitrogen rate by 30 pounds an acre, that would probably have a very significant impact on nitrate losses to groundwater. But if they're in that same rotation and only applying 150 pounds an acre and decided to reduce that rate 30 pounds an acre, would have a much more limited impact. And just in general, these nitrogen BMPs around rate are all about targeting a rate that really doesn't impact farm profitability over the long run. It also is not going to be in excess of what a crop can efficiently use, and efficient being the key word there. So fertilizer timing becomes about as important as overall rate being applied, at least in my mind, on sandy soils. We can have significant reductions by moving from a pre-plant application of nitrogen fertilizer to a split applied nitrogen fertilizer. The impacts of going from a fall to a spring application at the same rate of nitrogen fertilizer are a little less clear, if only because the type of soils where we see a lot of fall application, they tend to be heavier soils and they tend to lose more nitrogen to the air rather than to groundwater. So those BMPs related to fertilizer form, what we're talking about here usually is the use of nitrogen inhibitors that would slow the conversion of fertilizer nitrogen to nitrate, or the use of coated fertilizer products that are more more fine-tuned in terms of their release coinciding with when warm season crops like corn need them. These overall, when you look at the impacts on water quality, tend to have significantly less impact than either rate or timing. And then placement, this really gets down to is the fertilizer being incorporated into the soil or banded into the soil in some capacity, or is it just on the soil surface? And in terms of water quality impacts, to my mind, this is the hardest one to wrap my head around. For the reason that we know that soil fertilizer placed on the soil surface and not incorporated can lose significant amounts of nitrogen to the air as ammonia gas. And that nitrogen will essentially travel downwind some distance, and it will eventually rain out into the ground somewhere. We have a really hard time of tracking how far it's going to move, where it all is going to be deposited, and then how much of it's going to actually convert to nitrate. So my general sense is the impact of the placement is a little less than something like rate, but still significant. And I'd also say it's important to realize that these practices do interact with one another. For example, I mentioned that going from fall application to spring application, you might not see a huge impact on groundwater nitrate levels leaving that field if it's being applied at the same rate. But what you do often see is that if a farmer makes that switch from fall to spring, a lot of times they realize that they can get can optimize their yields with a little lower nitrogen rate, and so the two kind of interact with each other. One last thing I would talk about is just the idea of focusing on process or results, because part of how these farmers are evaluated in these areas is based on their adoption of BMPs, which might seem a little strange to focus on the process of adopting BMPs rather than the result of a increase or less impact of nitrate on the groundwater in that drinking water well area. And both of those are focused on in the Groundwater Protection Rule. But I would say that even though it seems a little counterintuitive to focus on the process, sometimes that is the more important thing to pay attention to, especially in certain landscapes and over short time frames. And I'll use an analogy just based on this picture from the area I live in the driftless region of southeast Minnesota. So if you happened to have a lot of soil erosion coming from this cornfield in the upper right hand of the screen after a big rainstorm, some of that eroded soil we know is never going to leave that field during that rainstorm or after it. And some of it's going to move into the grassed waterway that runs through the field and get trapped there. And some of it will move down into the wooded area in the middle of the screen into and stop in a gully. Some of it will make it down to the floodplain below that. And then some small fraction of it will make it during and after that rainstorm into the creek running through this picture. And so when you think about that, it might take years for that sediment that got moved from that one storm to make its way into the creek. And so if you decided, okay, we're going to switch this cornfield to a strictly no-till with cover crop situation, put in some new waterways, just really, really focus on keeping soil from getting into that stream, and greatly reduce erosion rates. Well, if you were to start measuring how is that impacting the soil that's getting into the stream, you might still see soil getting in there for quite a long time. And I think that's just because of the lag time between when something happens on the landscape and when it gets expressed in the water. And we know the same is true with nitrate and groundwater. It can take a very long time for what happens on the land surface to be seen in the groundwater. Where I live, we know that lag time with nitrates getting into groundwater can be very long and very complex. We have places where lag time in groundwater is just a couple years, and you tend to see pretty high nitrate levels in that groundwater, generally not increasing. And then you have areas where the lag time is slow, maybe 40 years or more, and nitrate levels are low, but they're going up. And so you almost have to focus on the processes, in this case, to adoption of nitrogen BMPs that you know will improve water quality over time, and just work to get a better sense of that lag time so you know when you can expect to see today's actions impact tomorrow's water quality. So that was all I had there, Rebecca, so I can go ahead and turn it back to you to handle the questions.
Great, so much. Thank you so much, Greg. And excellent job, everybody, answering some of these questions in the chat box. So we're going to go ahead, and we've got about 8 minutes left. And if we have additional questions, folks are, we won't go over too much, but folks are welcome to stay on to answer those final questions. So I'm just going to scan back up here to see what we might still need to answer. So Crystal asks a question for both speakers. I think mostly that would be Chrissy and Luke. Who initiated the policy process and who were partners to get it passed into law?
So this is Luke, and in Minnesota, the effort for us to create the nitrogen fertilizer management plan was really pushed by legislation in the Groundwater Protection Act. So the plan began there in our early 90s. The initiation to create a rule was largely in response to public comment in our plan, development process, and comments coming from all kind of facets in this conversation, our environmental, agricultural partners, and so we as an agency have carried this through the rule process, but we're encouraged to do so through that public engagement process.
In Ohio, this law happened just as I was starting, so I'm not quite sure exactly who initiated it, but in Ohio, we've just had a lot of harmful algal bloom problems in our large lakes and in Lake Erie. So I think there was a lot of public pressure. It's just an obvious need for something to help reduce these algal blooms, especially when they started impacting our drinking water resources.
Great, thank you both. And forgive me if these have already been answered, but Andrew asks how and who determined the 10-year, the DWISMA boundary lines, and then why 10 years and not longer? Santina from USEPA asks.
Yeah, I pitched a response and comment on that one, but in our state, it's our Department of Health through their source water protection program that devises these DWISMAs. And in that program, 10 years is the minimum of time from which they need to choose, that city needs to protect for or create plans to protect for. They can choose to do longer. We have some communities that have chosen 20-year time of travels, but by and large, it's a 10-year time of travel in our state for those through that process.
Thank you. And I'm going to go, Brian, to your second question in this series about additional resources. So for our crew here, are any additional resources, or can you say more about the additional resources being made available to incentivize adoption of BMPs, either local, state, or federal?
Okay, this is Luke again. And in Minnesota, we really have just an exceptional kind of collaboration going on amongst state agencies. So through funding through soil and water districts, our Board of Soil and Water Resources, for those organizations to promote conservation, we're seeing higher prioritization for those funds toward these vulnerable groundwater areas. We've also got kind of grant proposals in the works and underway, kind of working with our academic and industry folks to try to prioritize. So we've also got watershed planning efforts, one watershed, one plan throughout the state of Minnesota, where we're emphasizing the need to protect groundwater and providing those vehicles for funding implementation activity there. So it's really through many facets in Minnesota, we're trying to bring together more funds to prioritize these areas. And yeah, and another piece I referred to, the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification. For producers who do get involved in that program, they have access to additional funding to establish conservation. So to kind of complement the rule, where we do have the opportunity to get guys and gals involved in certification, there's additional funding, NRCS funding through that, or USTA funding, excuse me. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chrissy. Anything to add?
No, but thank you.
Okay, great. And I hope that Stan answered your question too about the MDA and additional resources. Okay, and I'm going to Aaron's question. Are rates and timing specifically laid out for each crop, i.e. the exact pounds per acre, the exact timing the application must take place? I'm assuming that for MDA or Minnesota.
Is the question whether there are very specific rates and timing laid out? Okay. Yeah, so it tends to be a range for rates depending on the crops. It is going to be different for every crop, but there is typically a range of rates that would be considered appropriate, and they tend to shift. They're driven primarily by economics and agronomics, but they do have some water quality benefits as well. In terms of timing, sometimes there are very specific things we find, let's say for corn that's not on irrigated ground, that once you start getting into the rapid growth phase of corn, the ability of a split application to really be economical tends to start going down. So later in the season, we recommend not doing a split application. However, on irrigated sands, we find that it's a much longer window. So there's some specific guidance on what is appropriate in terms of timing, but again, it tends to be more of a range.
Great, thank you. And final question from Santina: does incorporation prevent end losses in surface and groundwater?
Yeah.
To surface and groundwater.
Yes, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. That is absolutely the case. It's a little less clear, I would say, or harder to measure the connection to groundwater, because you know that not all nitrogen that's deposited on the ground is going to become nitrate, and that not all nitrate, or not even most of it, will be leachable to groundwater. And so it's hard to make the sense of like pounds per acre that could be lost to groundwater from ammonia gas from soil surface applied fertilizer, but it can be significant, especially for a surface water situation, because some of that ammonia gas is going to end up draining out into bodies of water where there aren't plants as much capable of taking that nitrogen out.
All right, great. So thank you to all of our presenters, and thank you to all of you participating on the line. We have a lot of expertise that always joins us on these webinars, some that are our presenters and some are our participants. I see, Brian is asking another question in the chat, so before we close out, if anyone would like to answer that for him, that would be great. We just want to share our speakers' contact information again, Chrissy, Luke, and Greg's email addresses. Again, this webinar will be posted at northcentralwater.org and learn.eextension.org. So feel free to share the information widely if you think others might be interested. And we also wanted to let you know about the upcoming webinar from our North Central Climate Collaborative, Animal Agriculture in a Changing Climate. I'm sure a number of you are interested in that topic as well, and that will be Monday, October 26th, a couple weeks from now at 1 p.m. Central. 2 p.m. Eastern. So thank you again so much. I really appreciate time and everything you're doing for water and the people that need it. And we will look forward to having you on a webinar again sometime soon. Thank you.